the continent's favourite podcast, coming to you this week from London town and a dungeon in the south of France. Sorry if it sounds a bit weird in here, listeners. I have tried to pad the dungeon, but it might still sound a little bit dungeony.
Yeah, not up to scratch, Katy. I'm lucky that in my parents' house in London, we've got a lot of soft furnishings. So hopefully this will be nice and damp sounding for you all. Damp? Yeah. Ooh.
Gross.
What are you doing in a dungeon in the south of France?
Well, the official version of events is that I'm down here to do some reporting from Nice about how people are planning on voting next weekend in this big old presidential election of ours, Macron v Le Pen. But I've also snuck in a few days down here with my family this week in the beautiful countryside about an hour away from Nice.
I won't feel too sorry for you then.
It's not all bad. What's coming up on the show this week, Dominic?
Well, last week the world was warned by scientists that we may only have 30 months left to turn the tide of global emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So every industry has a role to play in this transition if we're going to reach the goal of declining global emissions in 30 months' time. But today we're going to be looking at one industry in particular, an industry that has a much greater effect on the climate than you might imagine, the fashion industry. And we're going to be taking a look at a set of plans that the European Commission recently unveiled, plans to make fashion and textiles more sustainable. It's a proposal full of ideas about how to tackle the damage that fast fashion is doing to our planet, but will it work and is it enough? To discuss this further, we will be joined by the model and activist Nimue Smit later on in the show. But first, let's take a look across the continent to see who's had a good week and who's had a bad week.
Good week. Bad week.
Who has had a bad week, Katy?
It's been a bad week for immigration rights in our home country of the UK, Dominic. Last week, the government in London unveiled an incredibly controversial pilot scheme to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda on a one-way ticket. Yes, Rwanda, a country in East Africa, about 6,500 kilometres from the UK.
So quite an obvious question, but this is a policy that's aimed at discouraging asylum seekers from even trying to get to the UK, right?
Yeah, very much so. So the face of this plan is the British Interior Minister, Priti Patel, someone who I think is starting to gain some international notoriety now as a hardline conservative in the UK government, and someone who really doesn't seem to like immigrants despite being the child of immigrants herself. Anyway, just to recap the UK's geography and why it matters here, Great Britain is an island, which makes it really difficult to arrive there as an asylum seeker. Either you are granted asylum by the UK overseas and given the green light to get on a plane, which happens to extremely few people, or you're facing an incredibly dangerous journey if this is something that you've decided that you are desperate enough to do. So you can either try to jump on a lorry that is passing through the undersea tunnel from France to England, which is really dangerous. People often get into road accidents trying to do that. Or the alternative is that you try to set sail across the English Channel from France to the south coast of England. It's not a really wide strip of water, not much more than 20 miles, but it is one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. So there's a huge number of really fast-moving vessels, and you can really easily catch hypothermia. But in spite of those dangers, people are making that sea crossing in larger and larger numbers. Last year, it was more than 28,000 people. This year, we're on track for it to be significantly more than that. And the Conservative government of Boris Johnson, they're unsurprisingly not big fans of these asylum seekers arriving by boat. And it doesn't play well to their base to look like they're not doing anything about it. So in comes Priti Patel last week. She flies out to Rwanda and she announces this deal under which, if you are a young man who makes it to the UK uninvited, hoping to claim asylum, you will get put straight into a detention centre and then flown to Rwanda to claim asylum over there. And then, if you're successful, you get to stay in Rwanda. You don't get to come to the UK. Now, the UK government has tried quite hard this week to argue that this plan is justified because it's going to save lives and it's going to help dismantle people smuggling networks who profit from people's desperation. But Priti Patel is also hoping that it's going to act as a massive deterrent to people coming in the first place. There's actually quite a lot of people who've questioned whether this would actually work as a deterrent, because the people who make the journey to the UK, it's difficult to describe just how desperate they are to get here. They are trying to make this crossing, usually after a harrowing journey through the rest of Europe, because they really, really want to make it to the UK specifically, often because they've got family members already there. And the fact that they take these crazy risks shows in many cases that they consider themselves to be out of other options. So some charities have suggested that a lot of people are going to try to carry on making it regardless. And in fact, the top official in Priti Patel's own ministry, he warned that it wasn't even clear that this would work as a deterrent. She ignored his input, and she's gone ahead and used a really unusual mechanism to push this policy through. It's called a ministerial direction. It's super rare for a minister to do. And it means that Priti Patel is taking personal responsibility for this policy. Aside from all the doubts about whether it will actually work as a deterrent or not, the government's really not trying to hide the fact that that's what it hopes will happen. Boris Johnson said openly last week that Britain just doesn't want to pay to integrate asylum seekers into the UK. He said, "Our compassion may be infinite, but our capacity to help people is not. We can't ask the British taxpayer to write a blank cheque to cover the costs of anyone who might want to come and live here."
Well, it doesn't sound like his compassion is infinite.
No, it doesn't.
What's the opinion on whether or not this proposal is actually legal?
Well, the government says it is legal, but the UN Refugee Agency says that it isn't, and that if the UK did this, it wouldn't be following its international obligations. It's not following either the letter or the spirit of the Refugee Convention. The main thing that's ringing alarm bells for immigration lawyers and human rights groups is that Rwanda itself is not the safest or the freest country on earth, even though Boris Johnson has described it as one of the world's safest countries. And in fact, the UK government raised concerns itself last year at the UN over Rwanda's human rights record, not least allegations of torture and disappearances and extrajudicial killings. So to ship over asylum seekers to this country where they might not even be safe, especially if they're politically active, it could well land the UK government in court for not carrying out its duty to give protection to people who come to the UK seeking safety. And Boris Johnson knows that. He said he fully expected this policy to be challenged in the courts.
When I've been reading about it this week, it's kind of seemed like the UK government almost want this to become a legal fight and are enjoying it being on the front of the newspapers, partly as a distraction to Boris Johnson's difficulties with getting fines for, or so far only one fine for a party he had during lockdown. But also because they're now talking a lot about these like lefty lawyers who are pushing back against their hardline immigration policy. And it seems like they're trying to replay the arguments of Brexit, of taking back control of the borders. So yeah, maybe they don't even care if it's legal. They just want to shift the argument.
It does smack a little bit of that whole distraction technique thing, doesn't it? Not to sound too much like a conspiracy theorist.
But it's not the first time this has ever been done somewhere in the world, is it?
Yeah, so one of the strange things about this whole thing is that Priti Patel has called this arrangement with Rwanda a world first, which it really isn't. I don't know why the UK government is so obsessed with being able to say it's world-beating in all of its questionable activities. But yeah, you're right. Australia started using offshore detention centres in 2001 on the island of Nauru and shortly afterwards in Papua New Guinea. And this policy has just been criticised over and over and over again for how people have been treated under it, in terms of the conditions that people have faced in these detention centres, really high levels of self-harm and suicide among the people who get put there. And like this British plan, there have been plenty of complaints of the Australian policy being in breach of international law. For listeners in Denmark as well, this whole discussion might be ringing a bell because their government has also put quite a lot of effort into seeming as unwelcoming as possible. There was a Danish law passed last year to allow offshore detention centres. And Denmark is also in talks with Rwanda specifically to announce a similar policy to the UK one. Aside from that, there was also a program between Rwanda and Israel to take in asylum seekers who'd arrived in Israel. Thousands of people got sent to Rwanda as well as Uganda. And hardly any of them are thought to have stayed. Loads of them just left straight away and tried to make it to Europe or somewhere else.
So do you think Priti Patel will be happy with how this plan has gone down over the past week?
Well, I've got to be honest and say it's going down pretty well amongst people who want a more hardline immigration policy in the UK. You don't have to look very hard to find approving tweets from people of that kind of political persuasion. But it has got a lot of criticism from people with more left-leaning viewpoints. A lot of people pointing out, as in other European countries, that the Brits seem much more keen to welcome white Ukrainian refugees than Africans or Arabs or Afghans making this crossing across the Channel, who are also fleeing conflicts in their home countries. And even the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, he used his Easter address last weekend to call the government out on this and to say that it cannot stand the judgment of God. Opposition parties have also heavily criticised it. Partly, as you say, Dominic, they've suggested that it might be intended as a bit of a distraction from Boris Johnson being fined over parties at his offices right in the middle of the COVID lockdown. And even some members of his own party have come out and criticised it, not just on the grounds that it's shameful and says a lot about just how unwelcoming this government wants to be to people who really need help, but the government's also been taking a lot of criticism over the fact that they have no idea how much this policy would cost. Under the deal, Rwanda is going to get about 150 million euros worth of investment initially, but no one really knows how much extra it would cost in terms of flying people over there, in terms of legal fees, in terms of administering the system. So if the idea is to save British taxpayers all the money that they would otherwise spend on integrating and helping refugees, it's not really clear that it'll do that. And there's also a lot of people arguing that doing this at a time when the UK is actually short of labour in a lot of industries, that also doesn't really make economic sense. So then you start wondering, is this about the supposedly huge cost of taking in asylum seekers? Or is it about not wanting to take in people who are different?
How many asylum seekers does the UK actually take in compared to other European countries?
Well, it depends how you measure it. But I got some stats from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. And in 2020, the UK ranked 7th in terms of how many people it granted protection to when compared to EU countries. But when you adjust that to the size of different countries' population, it drops down to 19th place. The UK granted protection to 0.1 people per 1,000 Brits in 2020. And a big part of that is the fact that the UK is not joined to the continent. Getting there is hard, and the UK doesn't want it to be any easier. We've also seen that with Ukraine, you know? A lot of EU countries just dropped the need for Ukrainians to have visas to come in. People could just turn up on trains. The UK didn't do that. And so it was hard for people to get visas and then physically get across the sea to the UK. It's been really slow and frustrating for people. I think about 40,000 visas for Ukrainians have been issued, but only about 12,000 have arrived so far. To get over the whole question of geography making it hard to claim asylum in the UK, France actually offered last year to let the British government set up processing centres here in France so that they could open a legal migration route to the UK. But funnily enough, the British government hasn't been interested in that. And as far as they're concerned, France is a safe country. And if people have managed to get as far as France, they should just be staying here. And none of these people should be trying to make it to the UK.
So what actually happens with this Rwanda plan now? Is it actually going to come into force anytime soon?
Well, Priti Patel wants the flights to begin within weeks. This is just a pilot scheme, supposedly, and it would focus initially on young single men who are particularly unwelcome in Britain. But there may be a couple of spanners in the works. The Parliament has been away on its Easter break. We are recording this on Tuesday, which is when the MPs come back from their holiday. And they're going to have to debate an amendment on this power to send asylum seekers offshore. I really don't know how that's going to go. That's in the lower house of Parliament. In the upper house of Parliament, the House of Lords, it looks like this plan is going to face a fight. And one of the people leading that fight will be Alf Dubs. He's a Labour lord and a former child refugee himself. He was brought to England from Czechoslovakia in 1939 under the Kindertransport programme, and he's always been a staunch supporter of refugee rights. He's described his plan as awful and shocking, and he expects some of his colleagues in the House of Lords to fight it tooth and nail. But we will have to see if he's right. Cheer us up, Dominic. Who's had a good week?
It's been a good week for single parents in Spain after a few court rulings, one in Barcelona and one in Bilbao, that gave these single mothers access to more parental leave after childbirth by taking on some of the parental leave that would have gone to an absent second parent. That probably sounds really confusing. So to be more specific, judges decided in both these cases that a mother was allowed to use some of the father's days of paid leave, seeing as the father was not present in bringing up the child.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, it is.
How much leave do parents actually get in Spain?
Well, in 2021, Spain became one of the first countries in the world to give equal leave to both parents. So two parents now both get 16 weeks of parental leave each, both fully paid. It's not at the top of the ranking for mothers, but it's quite high up there for the second parent. It's really one of the best countries for becoming a father or second parent in the world now. This policy was designed to try to balance out some of the responsibility between mothers and fathers in bringing up their infants and to reduce some of the inequalities between men and women when it comes to the impact that having a child can have on your career. I don't know about you, but I keep hearing from, at least the heterosexual couple friends who are having kids around me about how hard it is to parent in a balanced way and avoid the mother doing so much more of the childcare at the start and making bigger career sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
I've been struck to see how different it is so often, career-wise, in heterosexual couples anyway, for someone becoming a mother compared to becoming a father. And some of that is obviously just to do with breastfeeding, but a lot of that is because in many European countries, the father just gets a few days or weeks of paid leave from work, if anything. And I know there are many countries around the world where there's no parental leave at all. So I acknowledge that we're talking here from a position of European privilege. But this law in Spain with equal leave between two parents really does seem to solve some of these inequalities between mothers and fathers. And it was designed with the condition that the leave cannot be exchanged between parents. This is because they didn't want to end up with a situation where fathers were giving most of their leave to mothers and they'd be stuck with the same societal issues with fathers not being expected to be involved in their child's upbringing as much as mothers are. The problem with that inflexibility is that the law was accused of being discriminatory towards single parents, and in over 80% of cases, that's single mothers. And there's this organization called the Association for Single Mother Families in Spain, and they've been fighting this discrimination and hoping for a change in the law that will allow single parents to get more parental leave to make up for the lack of leave from a second parent.
Yeah, it does seem to me to be totally fair to give some extra help on the leave front to single parents, given how financially disadvantaged they are, especially on other fronts.
Indeed, there are apparently tax disadvantages in Spain for single parents, and it's just obviously much more expensive bringing up children with one person's income as opposed to two. So these two court rulings, the one in Bilbao and the one in Barcelona, were a step forward. The single mother in Barcelona was offered 8 extra weeks of parental leave to look after her child. And the lawyer of the mother had quite an interesting argument. They said that paid leave is not a right of parents because they are parents, but rather it's a right of the child. The parents are given this leave in order to care for and protect for their child, which, yeah, I thought that was quite an interesting way of looking at parental leave as something that belongs to the child, not an individual parent.
Yeah.
And the judge in Bilbao actually cited the principle of equality that's found in the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child from 1990. So kids who only have one parent should have the same rights as kids who have two. The judge also acknowledged that the two-parent nuclear family is not the only family type that the state should be thinking about. The idea of what a family is has changed since the 1970s. And of course, there's also more that needs to be done to support rainbow families and families with more than two parents, something which I won't go into now because we are planning on talking about it more in a future episode.
So do these rulings just apply to the parents that they concern directly, or does it mean that it's going to apply soon to all single parents in Spain?
So for now, they just apply to those single parents, but they do create momentum towards more leave for single parents, and they join a few similar rulings in other Spanish regions. But the good news is that it looks like a law might soon be changed nationally in Spain to cement 26 weeks of parental leave for single parents. A law containing this proposal went through the lower house at the end of March, so progress is being made by legislators. And soon, children with single parents should be getting more time with their parent before they have to go to work. So a good week for the children of single parents in Spain.
We have some more generous people to thank for keeping this podcast alive. It sounds slightly overdramatic, keeping a podcast alive, but we really wouldn't be able to make it without people like Maria Kurtzendorfer, Nina V, Raluca, and Caitlin Masters, who have all signed up to send a few bucks our way each month on patreon.com.
You can join this gang and gain access to our secret Facebook group and maybe even get a personalized voicemail from us if you give a certain amount of money. Head to patreon.com/Europeans podcast to help us keep this show on the road or on the air.
Or alive. There's a lot of metaphors going on today. It's time to talk about fashion. Let's be honest, I wouldn't call the Europeans the most fashionable of podcasts. But actually, that's not fair to you. You've got some very nice jumpers, Dominic.
Thank you. I was about to say.
Whereas I am maybe the worst dressed person in France.
That's not true. You have some lovely stripy t-shirts.
I've been wearing yellow trousers while I'm in the South. I'm feeling snazzy.
Whoa.
Anyway, fashionable or not, we wear clothes just like everyone else. And every time we buy those clothes, we are making a decision that impacts the environment. Are you wearing something that's been made with materials that don't harm the planet? Are you buying something that's going to fall apart so quickly that you have to throw it away after wearing it 3 times? And that's without even thinking about all the other ethical considerations about whether it was made by people working under safe and fair conditions. As clothes wearers, we were very intrigued a couple of weeks back when the EU announced that it was proposing new rules to crack down on the fast fashion industry and try and force it to be more environmentally friendly. But is it actually a workable plan? How much impact would it actually have? I have to be honest and tell you that I have not really had the time during this crazy period of French elections to look at the plan that closely. So we found someone who kindly agreed to take a closer look at it for us, and someone with the expertise to tell us whether it's up to scratch or not. Nimoy Smit, she is a model and activist based in Amsterdam. She's also had a career in public health, as if that wasn't enough. And she is someone who has spent years thinking about how to make the fashion industry more ethical. We gave her a ring to ask, could the EU's fast fashion plan actually make a difference? Can you help us put things in perspective? Like, how big a contributor to the climate crisis is the fashion sector compared to like other industries?
I mean, the numbers on that are quite varying. I think mostly they say it's the 4th biggest contributor to CO2 emissions. I always find it hard, though, to really know what they take into account with that. You know, it has a massive component also in land degradation, and anything from the start of the process all the way down to the end of how the clothes are disposed has a massive impact on the environment.
And the European Commission want to do something about this.
Yeah.
You've had a look through their latest proposals. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what stood out to you in those proposals.
Well, one of the major issues, I think, is dumping of clothing on other markets. So when you have these clothing disposal boxes, people put their things in there thinking it would get a second life in other countries, which in some cases is true. But we also have massive garbage belts where clothes are basically just slowly decomposing. Also because the clothes we send are often of really poor quality or dirty, so they're not actually able to be reused. So what the Commission wants to do is to actually put a ban on shipping waste away to other countries and only really export products that are still usable as secondhand items. It's very exciting. I don't know how they're going to do it. They say they're going to put a sort of labeling system on there, but that was something that I was quite surprised about and excited about. On the other hand, there was also a whole section about creating a resilient and green industry. So really focusing on the development of green and sustainable alternatives for materials. If that could happen on a bigger scale, I think it would be really important. I think very few people know that a lot of our clothes are made from oil-based products. So all your synthetic fibers actually come from fossil fuels. So if we can replace those with natural fibers or fibers that can be easily taken apart, it would be a massive impact, I think.
Something that kind of rang alarm bells for me when I looked at this plan to make the textile industry greener is this idea that clothes need to be longer lasting, which sounds great, but surely it needs to be combined with like changing our attitude towards throwing clothes away less often, because otherwise doesn't it just mean that the clothes are longer lasting, but we're still chucking them away all the time?
Yeah, totally. There's very little in the reports that I read about awareness raising. I just have been seeing all these posts about how Shein has like the biggest impact on the environment at the moment. And a big contributor of why they're selling so well is all these haul videos where people just buy a ton of stuff, bring it to their house and like unbox it for their Instagram followers. So I think as long as we don't do anything about this idea of like, I have to go to the shop every week and buy 20 new tops, longer lasting is not per se gonna solve the problem. I think we often try to focus on the, limit your buys, love what you have, and learn how to repurpose or repair them. For that, to have items that actually are durable is super important.
I was quite excited about the durable thing, partly because I feel like whenever I buy a t-shirt these days, it only lasts like 5 months and then it's got holes in it already. So I'd love to have a t-shirt that would last at least 2 years, which is the idea.
What are you doing in these t-shirts? My t-shirts don't get holes in them, but maybe I don't move very much.
Yeah, maybe our jobs are slightly different, sitting down in front of a computer compared to running around in an opera rehearsal room. Maybe that's the difference.
Maybe it's that.
But one thing that I thought, like, if they are going to make these items more durable, presumably that's going to make them more expensive. And I guess the danger is maybe that they'll create a 2-tier system of clothing where, like, wealthy people can afford to have these durable clothes and everyone else has to keep buying the cheap stuff.
The interesting thing about the fashion industry is I think it really boomed after the Second World War, and there's been a big democratization of fashion. So where before you had maybe 1 or 2 skirts, and if you were richer, you had 5 and 2 dresses. Now the idea is that everyone should be able to buy whatever they want to have and have the same products or copies of the same products that are going down the runway. Well, before it was a really exclusive thing to have something like that. I think it's always important to keep in mind that we should have access to clothes for everyone. But regardless of the price, I think durability should always be incorporated, because even if you would have a smaller budget, to be able to invest in items that are with you for several years rather than a minute would be a better choice, I think. But it is a really difficult conversation. There's people that have written really good books about that. Like Aja Barber has written a book called Consumed, which really highlights how inequalities are still woven into the fabric of the fashion industry.
All of us wear clothes.
Yes.
Well, most of us wear clothes. I shouldn't speak for everyone. But we don't really talk about the environmental impact of fashion as much as we do for sectors like transport, I don't think.
No.
Do you think we don't tend to focus on it as an environmental issue because it's seen as a quote-unquote women's issue?
That is my idea, yeah. But I mean, that's purely from having been in this industry and seeing how many of its problems are being treated. I think for a long time it was seen as a very frivolous thing and something that only the female population was really spending a lot of time and money on. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, so it really should be critically looked at, I think, from an environmental perspective, but also labor laws and just generally how the industry is structured and it's treating its people and the planet. But yeah, it could very well be that it's just because people are like, well, you know, that's a women's thing. It's not that important. There's not so much happening in this industry. Why should we pay attention to it? I think it's been largely overlooked for that reason. Also because it's a lot of women working in this industry.
It does really feel like it's changing a bit now. Well, at least with this proposal, it's coming into the spotlight for once. And there have also been a lot of big fashion giants coming up with their own sustainable ranges in recent years, like H&M's Conscious range or Zara's rather strangely titled Join Life range, which is just not very well thought through, I don't think. Do you think these supposedly sustainable ranges are an important part of the solution?
Oh, difficult question, Dominic. I mean, I always think it's interesting to see when big brands feel the need to move to at least having some sort of a green line. Do I believe they're as green as people think they are? Maybe not. It's a very complex industry with difficult to trace supply lines. And many of these brands have also been accused for making false claims that they can't actually back up with data. But these lines, I mean, if they're the first step to something new, then yes, maybe let's look at it from a hopeful perspective.
Are there any brands out there that you think are definitely doing a good job at greenifying?
I think what makes this question a bit complicated is that there's also still not really a clear definition on what then are the best options. So for instance, you have Stella McCartney, who is a trailblazer for a long time by using no animal products. But then she does use a lot of polyesters and those kind of fabrics which are oil-based. So she's now greenifying more and more and has gotten B Corp certification. So she's very much ahead of the game. But mostly small brands do really well, because they have a smaller supply chain. They can make choices that maybe won't lead to maximization of profit, but will be the best choices for the environment. There's also great initiatives. Like a friend of mine here is starting a sustainable fashion gift card, which is a gift card you can give to people that only gives you access to sustainable stores and brands that they check for you. You also have Rank a Brand, which is a great app where you can just put in the brand that you love and they will let you know how sustainable they are and also give you suggestions for greener brands in the same category of items that you're looking for.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about companies like Shein or Shine, these like giants of the fast fashion world. When I was a teenager, we would buy cheap clothes like crazy. I feel terrible about it. Even though back then it was also cool to kind of find these really unique pieces of clothing in charity shops or vintage shops. We didn't think about it from an environmental perspective, I don't think. These days, apart from all the great things that you just talked about, there are these websites like Vinted and Depop. And here in France, we have this thing called Vestiaire for swapping clothes. Mm-hmm. Do you think on that level, the culture is changing? Do you think that en masse, people are starting to be a little bit less thoughtless when it comes to buying clothes and trying to buy secondhand clothes?
I think definitely there is an increasing awareness. And indeed, you can see that by those big resale platforms like Vestiaire, like Depop. I think it's also interesting to look at the sort of growth of the rental market. So more and more people are renting items that can, give their wardrobe a bit of a unique edge for a couple of days and then give it back to the system and someone else can use it. I definitely think it's a growing awareness. Like in the 14 plus years I've been in the fashion industry, it's gone from a very niche topic to a much broader discussed topic, not only by people in the industry, but also outside.
How do you think the fashion industry are going to be looking at this proposal from the European Commission? Do you think they're going to be quaking in their boots?
Are they going to be quaking in their boots? I think it definitely, like other regulations that we have had, so like the single-use plastic law that came a couple of years ago, like companies will be forced to take a look at their processes and make changes. Will they immediately be shocked? I don't think so, especially because a lot of the supply comes from outside of the EU. Because most of the factories are in China or other countries in Asia or in Latin America, it would be quite complex to make sure that the standards that we set here will also be finding their way into the processes of big brands. But it might give them, a scratch on the head moment and critically look at what's the minimum that we need to do to at least scrape by through these regulations.
And given what is possible to do on this end, do you think this plan goes far enough or not?
I was a bit sad there's nothing about regenerative fashion in there, which is a movement that's slowly been growing as well. So, for instance, if you take a look at cotton crops, they're usually monoculture crops that are grown. And people are saying, why are we doing this? We can also grow them in an integrative system. The yield will be less high, but we are taking care of the planet at the same time. I haven't seen anything about integrating regenerative practices into the fashion industry here.
So how exactly do these crops work?
For instance, instead of having a monocultural land filled with cotton plants that are not really functional for the ecosystem, you farm in an ecosystem way that also yields cotton. So while you're growing the cotton for your t-shirts, you're also, creating a better soil for other plants and for CO2 capture. I would love to see more regenerative aspects being taken into the European Union's plans.
Thank you very much to producer Katz Laszlo for cycling over to Nimoy's house and holding a microphone in her face. And thank you so much to Nimoy herself. If you are interested in the intersection between fashion and activism, both on the environmental front and on the human rights front, you should head over to Instagram and follow her there at NIMUESMIT. What have you been enjoying this week, Dominic?
Well, this is a perhaps weird one, but in honor of our interview today, I thought I would talk about an app that I've been using quite a lot, maybe an unhealthy amount.
Oh, yeah.
It's a Lithuanian app, and it's called Vinted. And I'm sure a lot of you know about it already, but it is my favorite way of buying secondhand clothes at the moment. I think most people probably wouldn't even realize that it's made in Lithuania and would assume it comes from Silicon Valley, but maybe it'll make you feel even warmer towards this nice venture, knowing that it's European.
Nice. What have you been picking up there?
Well, what I do is I find things I like in like the high street, and then I go and buy them online for cheaper.
Clever.
So I have like my favorite jeans from COS, which are really expensive in COS, and I just buy them often like basically new, been worn a few times, and they're a fraction of the price. It's great.
And better for the planet.
And better for the planet. Better for us all. What have you been enjoying, Katy?
I started watching the Netflix series Soil, or Grond, to give its Flemish title. Have you seen it yet?
No, I don't know about this.
So it is a Belgian comedy about a guy called Ismail who reluctantly inherits half of his dad's business. They're a Belgian-Moroccan family, and what the company does is it organizes the repatriation of dead bodies to Morocco because of this custom of Moroccan Belgians traditionally wanting to be buried back in the motherland. And it's hard to describe the plot without any spoilers, but let's just say that Ismail strikes on an ingenious way of disrupting the market of repatriating dead bodies back to Morocco. Sounds like an incredibly weird setting for a comedy, and it is a little bit dark, but actually the humor overall is kind of goofy. And I really enjoyed the first episode. I have to say, I had no idea that there was a tradition of Africans in Europe being repatriated upon their death, often at huge expense for the family. So it was just an interesting thing to learn about. And it also goes without saying that European Muslims and North African communities are massively underrepresented on the screen over here, especially in comedies. So it was just cool to see a funny show set against this backdrop of a family company that deals with this process. It's a slightly goofy comedy with elements of family drama. I don't think it's for everyone, but in the stressful election week, it was exactly what I needed. Soil on Netflix. Go check it out.
After your pretty bleak British bad week, I felt our British listeners deserved a nice happy ending, something to cheer them up with all the grimness of British politics.
Yes, please.
It is believed that this Thursday, the day the podcast goes out, the British Department for Education is going to announce a new GCSE. Now, GCSEs are the qualifications that kids in British schools work towards when they're around 16 years old. And the new GCSE will be on the subject of natural history.
Cool.
It's cool, right? It's something that the nature writer Mary Colwell has been campaigning for over a decade now, with the support of the UK's only Green MP, Caroline Lucas. And according to Mary, the GCSE will focus on processes of the living world. She hopes that this new school subject will help reverse the disconnect that so many of us feel from nature, teach us to love the natural world and think about how to protect it, to contribute to a better, greener future. I thought it was a small piece of unarguably good news from British politics for once.
For once. Right, I have a train to catch to Nice, so I had best be off. My life is very hard down here, Dominic. Next week, we've got a bit of a special episode for you listeners, which we're very excited about, so don't miss that in your feeds next Thursday. In the meantime, where can people catch us on the internet?
You can find us on Twitter at EuropeansPod, on Instagram at EuropeansPodcast, or you can email us hello@europeanspodcast.com. We will try to reply because we like receiving emails.
We're getting better at replying to them too.
We are, that's true, despite French election madness. Well done, Katy.
Ah.
We are part of the Are We Europe audio family. You can go and check out their other offerings at areweeurope.eu/audio-family. This episode was produced by Katy Lee and Wojciech Oleksiak. Thanks also to producer Katz Laszlo, who will be bringing us next week's story.
We'll see you then.
Bye.